Okay, welcome along, everybody. This unit is going to be a series of segments about Alaskan wilderness, and this will include some reflections on when I had the opportunity to work for the National Park Service at Denali National Park and Preserve. So, just to provide you with a history here, a huge conservation act was passed in 1980. That's the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, and that's abbreviated ANILCA. It was signed by President Jimmy Carter on December 2nd, 1980. This act has been heralded as the greatest conservation act in world history. In signing this act, Jimmy Carter tripled the size of the National Wilderness Preservation System. Remember, that became a reality with passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964. Also, just to point out, whatever people may think about Jimmy Carter's presidency, some people loved him, some people didn't, he has gone on to become perhaps our greatest ex-president ever. And among other things, he is the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He has worked tirelessly with Habitat for Humanity, and he even has established his own Carter Center to help with controlling the disease problems throughout the world, particularly in Africa. So, with the passage of ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, there was actually a great deal of controversy early on. And pretty much you had the Alaska Coalition pitted against the state of Alaska. Now, the Alaska Coalition was composed of all of the major environmental groups in the United States. The state of Alaska basically was trying to protect development interests, among other things, drilling for oil and so on. Ultimately, ANILCA added 56 million acres of wilderness. And here in the map that you can see, I want to point out where I worked, Denali National Park and Preserve, which is right in the center of the map of Alaska. And then I'll also point out that Gates of the Arctic National Park is just north of the Arctic Circle there. And then as you go down in the state, the lower section, you can see Wrangell St. Elias National Park. And I'll mention Denali quite a bit, but each of those other two parks just briefly. So Alaska is known for being the largest state. It's actually twice as big as the next largest state, which is Texas. It's known for the largest parks, Denali at 6 billion acres, Gates of the Arctic, again to the north, 8 million acres, and Wrangell St. Elias, 13 million acres. So some of these national parks are considerably larger than some of our eastern states. The highest mountain is Denali. It was formerly called Mount McKinley, and just a couple years ago, the change of name was to Denali, which means the high one in the native Athabascan language. Finally, many people refer to Alaska as the last frontier, and that's even what you'll see on the license plates in Alaska, the last frontier, and it is that. Now, even larger than those national parks is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And note here that it's 19 million acres. So this is just a huge wildlife refuge. And this is also where we have a source of controversy, and that has to do with the prospects of drilling for oil in the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. So there was many years ago a feature article in Newsweek, and it pointed out a number of things that I found particularly attractive in terms of some of the lessons that we've learned about in this class. Now, first of all, America's founding myths are largely about taming wild places. And we've learned in this class that there's been an evolution of American attitudes toward wilderness. basically changing in about the mid 1800s with the likes of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then all the way through John Muir, Robert Marshall, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, some of the other people who we've studied over the course of the semester. The article goes on to say the frontier shaped the American character even as we shaped it. And that's so true. We learned that wilderness basically helped shape the American character as it relates to tenacity and perseverance and the quest for freedom, these kinds of things. The article goes on, though, but the frontier is all but gone now, and what remains occupies a unique place in the American psyche. So, remember, Alaska is considered the last frontier. So, the issue has to do with oil. And again, this is a controversial issue, perhaps the biggest conservation controversy in the United States over the past several decades, oil. So we're going to take a look at this and how that relates to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. In December of 2017, so this was just a couple years ago, as part of that tax bill, it lifted a decades-old ban on oil and gas drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So this has happened relatively recently, in which this ban was lifted. There was never total protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but in this case, the ban that had been in place was lifted entirely. So let's look first of all at the perspective in favor of drilling. Okay, why would that happen? Why would that be considered important? And those who are in favor of drilling would say, well, to continue to promote the fossil fuel industry. In other words, from that perspective, it's very important to promote the oil and gas interests in the United States, and therefore that would be the perspective in favor of drilling. But part of the problem here is that nobody knows how much oil there is under the ANWR coastal plain. So let's assume that the Wilderness Society would come up with probably a figure that's pretty low, and let's say that the oil industry would probably come up with a figure that's pretty high. We would want to seek an unbiased assessment. And we can do that by looking at a U.S. Geological Survey study. And basically, there could be in the range, because no one knows, there could be in the range of 5 to 16 billion barrels. It's about a 9-month to a 2-year supply for the United States, approximately. Some estimates are as low as a 6-month supply. So the conservationist position would be this. We could save more oil by increasing energy efficiency and turning to renewable energy. So that certainly makes sense. And in so doing, this would also protect wildlife habitat for caribou, polar bears, wolves, etc. that depend on this Arctic environment for their very lives. Finally, this would protect the traditional lifestyle of the Gwich'in Indians. And there are actually humans who live up there who depend on, most importantly, the vast caribou herds. The vast caribou herds. So I participated in a webinar recently, and there were Gwich'in Indians that were part of this online conference, and they called their land, quote unquote, the sacred place where life begins. And so basically there is a spiritual significance of the land for them. Not only that, of course, they depend on the land for their livelihood. They use food, clothing, even tools from the caribou. Well, there's present anxiety among Native communities, obviously, given what has recently happened, lifting the ban on oil development, and they are basically fighting for survival. They have occupied the land for thousands of years, and as they expressed in this webinar that I was a part of, they said, "We matter." There was on the wall of a community center in a small Gwich'in village in Alaska the following statement, again on the wall of a community center: "We have lived our sustainable way of life off this land for 20,000 years. Must we now sacrifice it for 6 months of oil?" The other thing is that there's the issue of global climate change. Now, we spent an entire unit on wilderness and climate change, so I won't go over all of that again, but note that if more oil is discovered and that if that oil is eventually consumed, then that's going to contribute to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and exacerbate climate change. So you're aware of the presidential perspective of Jimmy Carter, who set aside this land, greatest conservation act in world history. And here's another presidential perspective that I think may help shed light on the Alaska question. Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. All you can do is keep it for your children, your children's children, and for all who come after you. And you know who said that? The photograph here gives you a clue. The person standing to the right is John Muir, and next to him is Theodore Roosevelt. And interestingly enough, Theodore Roosevelt wasn't talking about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That was not on his radar at the time. He was talking about the Grand Canyon. He was speaking about the Grand Canyon. So going back to that Newsweek article, this is how it ended. Once again, the way Americans engage their frontier will reflect, in no small measure, the national character. So let me go over briefly the conservationist intent, and that is conservation groups and the individuals that make up those groups seek permanent protection, since this level of conservation is popular with voters. So it's not just the people that are involved in the conservation groups, but a lot of other people as well are supportive of this. And as far as these major conservation groups are concerned, they make up a large and powerful coalition. So what is it that we can do? Well, there are a number of things because we live in a democracy. So let me go over a couple of things. You can learn more about the issue. You can go to ourarcticrefuge.org and learn more. You can join a conservation association, and these associations will keep you apprised of what's going on. I'm a lifetime member of the Sierra Club. It's both a national organization with international influence, actually, but also there are local chapters that you can be involved with, for example, the San Diego chapter. You can call and or write, by write I mean email, elected officials, and I do that frequently myself, corresponding with my representatives, my senators and so on. You can talk about this with family and friends. You can educate them. And by all means, because we live in a democracy, it is both our privilege and our obligation to vote. And so I encourage you to vote on November 3rd, 2020. So I leave you with this question, given what I just said. Do we, as citizens, have an obligation to participate in our democracy? Why? Again, I'm going to leave you with that question.